welcome the ambassador from Brazil here tonight. Thank you very much for coming. And other guests and some of our regular visitors as well. As you know, ANCLAS runs regular public events. This is a public lecture and a film tonight. And we're very excited to see that and to listen to Bruna Franchetto here. Bruna received her doctorate from the Postgraduate program in social anthropology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in 1986. She is now Associate Professor at the Federal University, a member of the Postgraduate programs in Social Anthropology and Linguistics, as well as a Research Fellow of the Brazilian Council for Scientific and Technological Development. Bruna coordinates research and documentation projects on Amerindian languages. Since 2009, she has coordinated the Indigenous Languages Documentation Program, an initiative of the Indian Museum and UNESCO. She's a member of the Technical Commission of the National Inventory for Linguistic Diversity and consultant for international programs for linguistic documentation of endangered languages. It is a great honour to have Bruna here with us tonight. So I'll leave it to Bruna. Thank you very much. If you're not on our ANCLAS mailing list, make sure you get on the mailing list tonight before you go. We have decided, because of the weather and so forth, we'll go with the lecture and the film, and then we'll have refreshments afterwards. So don't leave. We can continue the conversation later. Thank you, Bruna.
Thank you. First of all, good evening to everybody. And I would like to acknowledge the ANCLAS for invited me to make this presentation, especially Faye Bundrups, Carlos Pio, the Brazilian Embassy, Camila Giunchetti, and the Ambassador Ruben Barbosa, and last but not least, Ayatsis, all Ayatsi people who made it possible for us to be here. This is like a roadmap of our presentation. I will talk a little bit, what does it mean to be indigenous in Brazil today, especially in indigenous rights as defined by Brazilian laws. Second, some general information on population, indigenous population and indigenous lands. Then our focus, languages, indigenous languages. Language programs and projects in Brazil. And finally, some comments, some observation of the indigenous school education. The constitutional rights of the indigenous people in Brazil are expressed in a specific chapter of the Constitution of 1988, aside from other regulations throughout the constitutional text and an article of the Acts of Transitory Constitutional Regulations. This deals with the rights marked by at least two innovative and important concepts in relation to prior constitution and the so-called the Indian Statute, o Estatuto do Índio. The first innovation was the abandonment of the assimilation point of view, which considered the indigenous people as a transitory social category destined to disappear. The second innovation is that the rights of the indigenous people over their lands are defined in the Constitution as original rights that are prior to the creation of the state itself. This is a result of the de facto historical recognition that the indigenous people were the first owners of Brazil. The new constitution establishes in this manner a new conception of the relation between the state, Brazilian society, and the indigenous peoples. With the new constitutional concept, the indigenous people were assured of respect for their social organization, customs, languages, beliefs, and traditions. For the first time, the indigenous people of Brazil were recognized as having the right to be different, that is, to be indigenous people and remain that way indefinitely. This is stated. So, what does it mean to be indigenous? How indigenous people are defined today in Brazil. It's an indigenous person, indio, is any member of an indigenous community recognized by the latter as such. And an indigenous community is any community founded on kinship or co-residence relations between its members who maintain historical cultural ties with pre-colonial indigenous social organizations. Kinship and co-residence relations constituting the community, the indigenous community, include relations of affinity, adoptive affiliation, and ritual or religious kinship, and are more generally defined in terms of the conception of fundamental interpersonal bonds held by the community in question. For the national census to be declared or defined as indigenous, as Indio, it's a question of just self-declarations. In the census of 2000, the census of 2000 revealed an unexpected growth of the indigenous population from 294,000 people to 400,000 people in 9 years. This incredible growth was also a consequence of the growth of the number of people who identified themselves as indigenous, especially in urban areas. The census of 2010 adopted a specific questionnaire in order to collect information on ethnical membership and on native languages spoken by those who identified themselves as indigenous. So now we have an official, after 2008, the census of 2010, we have an official recognition of the great ethnic and linguistic diversity in Brazil. But unfortunately, the census number express many times an overestimation that must be revised. It's being revised now. We will see this in a moment. Back to the Federal Constitution. You see in the article, the main article, the Federal Constitution on Indigenous Rights, this is the Article 231, defining the indigenous rights to lands. It is recognized that the indigenous peoples have the right to the social organization, customs, languages, beliefs, and traditions, and their original rights over the lands that they have traditionally occupied. It being the duty of the federal government to demarcate these lands, protect them, and ensure that all their properties and assets are respected. The text in force gives a constitutional category or status to the concept of indigenous lands, which is defined as follows: lands traditionally occupied by indigenous people, although they inhabited, used for their productive activities, welfare, and necessary for their cultural and physical reproduction, according to their uses, customs, and traditions. These characteristics, therefore, define a specific area of land as being indigenous. Once these characteristics are present and are verified in accordance with the uses, customs, and traditions of indigenous people, the right to the land by the community that occupies it is an existing right, and it's legitimized independently of any constitutional act. In this sense, the demarcation, the so-called demarcation of indigenous lands, the result of recognition by the state, is an act that merely states or declares that said land is indigenous, and its goal is simply to delineate the real extension of their title to ensure the full efficacy of the constitutional ruling, and the state has the obligation to protect these indigenous lands. With regard to indigenous land, the Constitution of 1988 stipulates further that the indigenous land are included as part of the assets of the Federal Union, Their use is specified for the permanent holding and title by the indigenous peoples. All juridical acts that affect this ownership and title are nullified and extinct, except the relevant public interest of the federal government. Only the indigenous people can use, and have the right to use the assets derived from the soil, the rivers, and the lake in these areas. The use of the water power resources, including energy potential, research and mining claims, can only be valid with the authorization of Congress after a hearing with the communities that are affected, and the communities assure the participation in the results of the mining activities of their lands, on their lands. Sorry, what happens? And more, new ordinary legislation is needed to specify the conditions for mineral exploration and the use of water resources on indigenous lands. The indigenous lands cannot be sold, mortgaged, or encumbered in any way, and the right to these lands by the respective indigenous peoples can never expire. So these are the rights warranted in Brazilian Constitution since 1988. So the Constitution of '88 created the need to set up a review via ordinary legislation and the inclusion of new themes in the juridical debate about the indigenous communities. Beginning in 1991, law bills were presented by the executive branch of the government and by deputies to regulate the constitutional clauses and adapt to the term of the new constitution the old legislation based on the principles of assimilation of the indigenous communities to the so-called national community and the tutorial relationship between the government and the indigenous people. Now, just to jump from the world of constitutional laws to the real world, in order to speak a little bit about, not only about endangered languages, but also about endangered indigenous land and endangered indigenous culture. In the transitory constitutional regulation, 5 years was stipulated as the time frame for the demarcation of all indigenous lands in Brazil. Unfortunately, this deadline was not honored, and the demarcation are still a pending matter. Though the legal basis in support of the most fundamental claims of the indigenous people in Brazil was formulated, and it is, in the new constitution, and has been currently expanded and rearranged. However, Brazilian reality shows that it is up to the indigenous communities and their allies to make possible the difficult task of making the laws complied with, assuring the respect of indigenous rights in practice in the face of many different economic interests that had and still have the audacity to ignore the existence of these rights. Just to cite some of the instruments, the agribusiness, mining companies, and what I think that is a narrow-minded developmentalist ideology. To ensure that the Constitution is in force is a permanent challenge. It is the role of the indigenous communities, as well as their organizations, support entities, university, prosecutors, and other groups of the civil society to defend the indigenous right. We know that this is a slow process and is actually conditioned by the task of making the whole society as aware of the situation. Success will necessarily depend on the degree of commitment on a day-to-day basis on the part of everyone involved in this effort. Now, just to show you some general overview on Brazilian indigenous lands and population. So as you see, the Brazilian territory is more than 8,500,000 square kilometers. The indigenous lands already demarcated are 619, according to the Institute of Environmental Issues. It's NGO, a Brazilian big NGO, ISA. Indigenous land are 691. So the indigenous lands occupy more than 12%, maybe 13% of the total Brazilian territory. The population, the total Brazilian population, according to the last census, or to 2010, is almost more than 190 million people. The indigenous population is almost 1 million, maybe, but just 1.4% of the total population. 57 of the indigenous population live in indigenous lands, 36% in urban areas, and 7% in rural areas. The urban indigenous population is growing each year. Ethnic groups. Ethnic groups means ethnies, I don't know, but it's in the name of indigenous peoples, are, according to the Conselho Indigenista Missionário, a branch of the Catholic Church, there are 235 ethnic groups. According to the NGO ISA, 242. And according to the last census, 305 ethnic groups. The sick means that this is an overestimated number. What about language, indigenous languages? We have no precise numbers. Two linguists, like Ariel Rodrigues and Danny Moore, counted between 160 and 180 languages still spoken in different degrees of vitality, in different degrees of endangerment. Once more, the number given by the last census is overestimated. 274 languages is an overestimated number. So if we just in this map, if it's possible to see indigenous communities, indigenous groups are very different in terms of size, their size. The big red circle indicates population over than 10,000 people, between 10,000 people and 25,000 people. But the average number of indigenous peoples is 250. So we have a very different situation from communities, from groups with more than 10,000 people to small groups with less than 50 people, especially in Amazonia. And we have more to the number given by NGOs, by researchers. We have to add to a specific situation. Why the situation of the so-called isolated groups? This number more than 50 means not exactly more than 50 isolated groups, and more than 50 times that isolated indigenous groups has been watched, has been discovered by the government, by FUNAI, the governmental institution for indigenous affairs in Brazil. So this denomination is given to those indigenous groups with which the organ of the federal government in charge of Indian affairs, Fundação Nacional do Índio, FUNAI, has not established permanent contact. No one knows for sure who they are, how many they are, and what languages they speak. And also the opposite side, you have the question of the so-called emerging identities or ethnogenesis, especially on the coast of Atlantic coast, of all the Atlantic coast of Brazil. So an increasing number of populations demanding publicly and officially their condition as indigenous. The demands usually come from families which, racially mixed and territorially plundered, have reencountered a political and historical positive context to the rescue of indigenous collective identities, the name of a people, the name of a language. Regional histories are being restudied, indigenous rights becoming more widely recognized and respected, organization of support to the Indians are being consolidated. We can see at least two main properties of ethnogenesis. One, the connection with territorial disputes, and second, complex regional historical processes of relationship between native and non-natives. So the emerging identities, the so-called ethnogenesis, this is an anthropological concept, ethnogenesis, is happening especially on the coast, over the Atlantic coast of Brazil. It's a complex and controversial subject, without any doubt, that leads to a posture that is the result of ignorance, prejudice, and or dispute for the possession of land. Normally we hear comments like, oh, these guys say that they're Indians, but they are not. That even so, many new indigenous ethnics arose in the last 10 years. Now, focus on the languages. We are linguists. The Brazilian team here in Australia, we are 3 linguists. I forgot to present my 2 partners, Lívia Souza and Rafael Nonato. They are in the back there. Lívia is a doctoral student, and Rafael is a postdoctoral student at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. So our main interest is languages. We work, we study, we do research on indigenous languages in Brazil, and we are here in Australia to visit, to know the situation of indigenous languages in Australia in order to compare and see what are the similarities, see what are the differences. So, realistic figures, think about 241 ethnic groups in Brazil, and between 150 and 170 languages, dialect excluded, still spoken. So we don't have a precise number of how many indigenous languages we have in Brazil. It's a big diversity, but we have no precise numbers. Things will be better when the INDL, the National Inventory of Linguistic Diversity, will begin, hopefully this year. It's a big program. It's a governmental program. And after, I don't know how many years of survey, in field and deep survey, we will know, I hope, a more precise number of the indigenous languages spoken in Brazil, as well as their real degree of vitality of endangerment or even of obsolescence. This map, you see, this map is the adaptation of the well-known, at least in Brazil, map, so-called ethno-linguistic map, done by German ethnologists in 1944. Kurt Unkel, a German ethnologist adopted by the Ticuna people, and he produced this map in order to give an idea of the pre-Columbian or pre-conquest Brazil. So before the Portuguese, before the conquerors, it is estimated that in Brazil there were over 1,000 group denominations, between 2 and 4 million people, and around 600 languages. This map is just as you know, the visual impact of the linguistic and ethnic diversity in pre-Columbian period. Just in green, you have Carib, the languages pertaining to the Carib family. In red, the Tupi languages, Arawak languages, and Macrogé in yellow. But there are so many colors and nuances indicating the enormous linguistic and ethnic diversity. And if you compare with these maps on the right, you see how the depopulation was devastating, especially along the Atlantic coast and their inland. The concentration today of most ethnic indigenous people and their languages are mainly in the Amazonian area, northwest Amazonia. The population loss was certainly more than 80%, maybe 85% in 500 years, in 300 years. And the language loss was terrible. Also more than 80% of the languages probably spoken 500 years ago disappeared after 300 years. So today, approximately, we have 1,000 indigenous languages in the Americas. In Brazil, 160, 170, 160 indigenous languages, distributing into 2 macro families, 40 families, and 10 isolated groups. An average of between 250 and 270 speakers per language. But you see, we have 24% of the today spoken indigenous language in Brazil with 50 or less than 50 speakers. Just 15% for languages with more than 1,000 speakers. 10% of languages with between 500 and 1,000 speakers. 18% languages with 250 and 500 speakers, in 25% exactly between 100 and 250 speakers. Many different situations. And this just to show you an idea of the incredible genetic diversity of indigenous languages in Brazil. To have the tronco means stock, they are macro family, the Tupi macro family on the left in yellow, with many families inside it. The tronco macrogé, the macrogé macro family on the right, with also many families inside it, and the other one. So just to have an idea of that enormous diversity from the point of view, genetic, historical diversity of indigenous languages, but still spoken today. some words on the endangerment. All the indigenous languages are in some way endangered. 21% of these languages can be considered in immediate danger because of small numbers of speakers coupled with low transmission from one generation to the following generation. 13 of the languages are considered to have complete descriptions, just 13%. To have complete descriptions means grammar, text, and dictionary. 38% have some advanced description, like a doctoral thesis, for example. 29% have just an incipient description, a master thesis, and 19% have no scientific description at all. But things are changing. So documentation of indigenous languages in the last 10 years is growing in Brazil. This is a good news. Through international programs like the documentation of endangered languages, the DOPS program, the German DOPS program, the ELDP, Endangered Language Documentation Program of the University of London, and so on. 30 languages, Brazilian indigenous languages, have been documented by these international programs. The Museu Paraense Emílio Goeldi in Belém, at the mouth of Amazon River, it's a research institute of the Ministry of Scientific Development, is documenting 20 Amazonian languages. The National Inventory of Linguistic Diversity documented 5 languages through its pilot projects between 2008 and 2010. And the Brazilian Program for the Documentation of Indigenous Languages, PRODOCLIN, documented between 2009 and the last year, 13 languages, targeting 54 communities, and is more important at all, from my point of view, the training of 25 indigenous researchers trained in documentation, in language documentation. The Brazilian Program for Documentation of Indigenous Culture, PRODOCLIN, also a brother of PRODOCLIN, does not have language documentation, it's its major goal. 23 projects feed a digital archive with huge amounts of linguistic material, targeting 53 communities of 24 indigenous groups and languages, with 45 indigenous researchers being trained in video documentation and anthropological research methodologies. Just to show you some, with more detail, the Program for Documentation of Indigenous Languages and Culture. This is a governmental initiative. At the Museu do Índio, there's an educational branch of the FUNAI, of the governmental institution for indigenous affairs, and UNESCO. This program began in 2009 after an agreement for collaborative documentation signed in Rio de Janeiro by the FUNAI, the National Museum of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. And the same agreement was also signed by the Museu Goeldi. And in 2008, Decreto Lei law was signed by the Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, for the implementation of documentation program for indigenous languages, or PRODOCLIN. The goals of this first official documentation program for the documentation of indigenous languages has the following goals, main goals: to promote the documentation of indigenous languages and cultures in Brazil, widening the possibility of their preservation, to consolidate the linguistic and cultural documentation in Brazil through the training of indigenous and non-indigenous researchers, and to build digital archives at centers for documentation in the indigenous lands and villages, at the Museu do Índio, and other Brazilian public institutions. So, audio and video documentation are made of cultural meaningful speech and cultural events as defined by and with the indigenous communities. All recordings are digitalized, deposited, archived in the Museu do Índio, and copies of all recorded and collected materials are sent back to the indigenous communities, where sometimes we found documentation centers. This is just an example. The documentation center at the village of Ipace. These are Kuikuru people. These are the inauguration of the documentation center at the Ipace village in a few years ago. And all the program for documentation of indigenous language and indigenous cultures observe strict norms of ethical norms, like the rules of access to the archived materials are defined with the communities. There are normal conducts, including especially the respect for intellectual property rights. And each project is documented, is based on the documented approval by the communities. And official bilingual or multilingual agreements between the archiving institution, in this case the Museu do Índio, FUNAI, and the communities and or indigenous associations. 13 projects have been documented by the program PRODOCLIN. This is 13 languages. And 17 communities has been targeted by the documentation of cultural aspects. So in this map you see the distribution of the projects, the PRODOCLIN and PRODOCULT projects. In red, the red circles of documentation, linguistic documentation projects, and in black, cultural documentations projects. Results expected and attained. We have now multimedia digital archives with recorded annotated session, social linguistic surveys, basic descriptive grammars, lexical databases, dictionaries, scientific and pedagogical publications, CDs and DVDs for indigenous schools, divulgation and exhibitions, and mini sites. Each project and each community has now its own mini site. Just if you want, after this, these are just one example of the results of documentation projects. These are catalogs of exhibitions, trilingual catalog in Portuguese, English, and indigenous language, of exhibition organized by the indigenous communities and their association during the documentation projects. So once more, this is a result that we would like to highlight. For the PRODOCLIN, the Program for Documentation of Indigenous Languages, we have now 25 indigenous researchers trained in linguistic documentation. And through PRODOCULT, we have now 45 indigenous researchers trained for research and audiovisual documentation. For me, at least, this is one of the more important results of this effort. So just to show some images of training courses in linguistic documentation for indigenous and non-indigenous researchers in the realm of the PRODOCLIN, the Program for Linguistic Documentation. This is at the Museu do Índio in Rio de Janeiro. And it also not just training courses in Rio de Janeiro, but also training courses in indigenous areas and villages, and different communities. So, good and bad. Certainly, the project for collaborative documentation have a real positive impact, because they change in attitude towards languages, for strengthening bonds between generations inside the indigenous communities, for the empowering of native young researchers, and rising of a generation of native filmmakers. We'll see an example in the movie this night. But there is always but. In Brazil, unfortunately, we don't have specific programs or projects for revitalization. We have cases, not few, of languages almost dying, the so-called almost sleeping languages. They need urgent intervention by means of revitalization projects. Unfortunately, we don't have in Brazil an explicit and coherent governmental linguistic policy. We don't have language programs. And in general, indigenous languages, not cultures. I'm not speaking of indigenous cultures, but languages. The indigenous languages are still invisible, or maybe better, inaudible. So the last topic, bilingual education. The right to be different does not imply fewer rights or privileges, because the Constitution of 1988 assured indigenous people the right to use their languages and their own processes for education at schools, inaugurating a new phase for the implementation of indigenous grade school education in Brazil. You see, since 1990, a dedicated branch of the Ministry of Education has been responsible for indigenous education, defined in many legal norms as specific, differentiated, bilingual, and intercultural. Today, indigenous schools, almost all indigenous schools, have indigenous teachers and specific curricula, calendars, and physical structures. Indigenous teachers are formed in specific courses at the high school and undergraduate levels. And more recently, we have good examples of affirmative policies for the access of indigenous people to public university. According to the census, the last census, we have now in Brazil almost 3,000 indigenous schools and 200,000 indigenous students in these schools. 12,000 indigenous teachers, 5,000 with undergraduate course. Certainly, bilingual education had been a positive impact for the maintenance of indigenous languages. But, once more, there are many limits and contradictions between the official discourse and local practices. What does it mean in practice to have a bilingual education? Indigenous languages, unfortunately, indigenous languages are still in the background in many indigenous schools, where Portuguese is dominant, even if the indigenous teachers don't speak Portuguese as their first language, And they are teaching in Portuguese to indigenous students whose first language isn't Portuguese. This is not an exceptional situation, with the current situation. Indigenous languages are still unknown or unnoticed in non-indigenous schools and until the university. What does it mean, intercultural indigenous education? What are the intercultural best practices in school environments? I know very few well-succeeded intercultural practices in indigenous schools, and no one for non-indigenous schools in Brazil. And what does it mean to be a specific and differentiated indigenous education? Indigenous education is a separate national system parallel to the non-indigenous national educational system. It is at the same time a positive conquest and a negative possibility. Unfortunately, in many cases, specific and differentiated means an education of bad quality, weaker, inferior, reinforcing a linguistic and cultural apartheid. Until now, we have just 150 titles of pedagogical materials, publication, monolingual and bilingual publications. It's very few for indigenous education. We saw in Uemundu, the Walpurgis schools a few days ago, and we saw more than 150 publications or pedagogical materials in Walpurgis language, just in one school near Alice Springs. So very few still pedagogical materials and publication for indigenous schools. Well, back to the future. It's beyond any doubt that Brazilian laws, Brazilian constitution, first of all, are solid and very advanced. But we must remember that rights need to be constantly enforced against anti-indigenous economic and political interests. Indigenous languages and oral traditions need to be visible and audible everywhere, documented, appreciated, enhanced. Indigenous education, we need to enforce good practices and discourage bad practices. And this is the end point. Thank you very much.